First letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. First letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God, for it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. This is the word of God. Now, growing up, I would spend, as a young boy, I would spend many months in the summer, especially living with my grandparents in a village about an hour away from our home. Back then, there was no such thing as the internet, young people. There was no such thing as the internet. They had no phone, no TV, but you would never find yourself bored there. There was just so many things to do in the village. As I recall, their only electronic device was a battery-operated radio. So I would spend days just exploring and roaming the village. I would shepherd or sheep or herd the geese and the ducks. I would roam around and explore the village. It was there, working with my hands, that I fell in love with dirt and soil. I was chased by a bull and learned how to climb trees. It's there in those dusty country roads that I first learned how to drive my grandparents' old stick-shift car. By the time I was about 12 or 13 years old, in my mind I was fully convinced that when I grew up and had a family of my own, I would move back and live in the village in a house where my grandma and grandpa lived. In front of the yard stood the biggest walnut tree in the whole village. Our grandpa built a swing for us there. And then in the late summer, right before the school began, our hands would be stained brown by peeling all those walnuts. You guys remember those days? Some of you do. There were fruit trees, all sorts of berries, fresh vegetables. They had chickens and geese and ducks and a pig at one point, but we ate it. My grandpa pastored a local small church where everybody knew everybody else. And as a boy, I could not imagine a better place to live than this. Everything felt just really good. It felt like home. It was perfect. Now, if there was one thing that I did not like about the village is the muddy roads in the spring and the fall. As far as I remember, there was only one paved road that ran through the length of the village, but all the other roads, when the late rains or the early rains or the snow melted, those roads just turned into mud, just rivers and rivers of mud. And you couldn't drive through it, you couldn't walk through them without getting your shoes stuck in the mud. And to solve the mud problem, they would have a big tractor or a truck drive through the village occasionally and to create deep tracks in the mud. And so as long as you stayed in those tracks, you can get around the village. But as long as you stayed in them, but if you somehow drifted away and got off the tracks, chances are you were going to get stuck. Recently, I was in the car with a lane departure warning system. For those of you who don't know, and I didn't know that either, but it's a system that uses kind of a combination of cameras and radars to detect when you as a driver are drifting away from your lane. And it'll notify you as the driver and the rest of people in the car that you have somehow drifted away from the lane. Now, we're a long way from the tractor-made tracks in the mud, but the idea is the same. As long as you stay in the proper lane, chances are you will be safe. And the warning message becomes a sort of a rail that keeps us from getting hurt. Now, the only purpose for this system is to get our attention and to make us realize that somehow we have gotten off track. But we get off track not just on the roads, don't we? You see, our body often warns us that we have stopped eating healthy or exercising. There are warning messages in marriages that if we don't pay attention to these warning message signs, chances are this marriage will have trouble or struggle to survive. We have warning signs all over. We have a warning sign in our car that tells us that the tire pressure is going low, or a warning sign that tells us the engine is about to overheat. Warning systems are built into so many spheres of our lives. But their only purpose is to grab our attention so that you and I could see the reality. They can't make us do anything. In fact, I have a little light in my car that says my tire pressure is low, and it's been like that for a long time now. And it's not the tires, I know. So the warning system can't make us do anything. They simply say, look, there's an issue here. Somewhere you have gotten off track, and if you don't fix this issue, it could be costly, pricey, painful, or even dangerous. The opening paragraphs of Paul's letter to the Corinthian church is filled with warning messages that is meant to grab their attention and recognize that they have gotten off track. Paul wants them to see that the reason they're divided in the church is that they have drifted away from the true gospel. Somehow, somewhere, they have drifted away from the central message of the gospel, specifically the message of the cross. He warns them, certainly he does, but then he speaks of the cross in terms of three realities. He does this because he wants them to recognize that in their pursuit of Christianity, they have gotten off track and lost sight of the cross of Christ. So first, Paul says the cross exposes the reality for what it is. The cross exposes the reality for what it is. Now look with me again in verse 18, where Paul says, "For the word of the cross is folly or foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." So in addressing the church, Paul points his finger to the cross as if to say, Christians, that is the only thing that should really matter to you. And by doing that, Paul exposes the difference between wisdom and the illusion of wisdom. Now, my guess is that we will never meet a person in life who would tell us that I just want to live a life like a fool. I don't care about my health. I don't care about relationships. In fact, I don't need relationships. Any money that I get, I will spend it on whatever gets my attention first. I will ignore people who care about me, and I will just live my life the way that I feel is best, the way that I know is best. Now, we might never meet a person who tells us these things, but we all know people who live that way, don't we? And we look at the way they live and we go, what a fool. Now to them, their life is perfectly normal. Whatever little wisdom they think they have, they try to use it. But then someone wiser, someone more mature comes along the way and exposes their wisdom for what it is. Foolishness. Now, as parents, we see this quite often, especially when our children are young and growing up, when they do something foolish. And you ask them, why'd you do this? They give one of two answers. One is, I don't know. And the other one is, I thought it was a good idea. Now to them, whatever they've done, they didn't do it because they knew it was a bad idea or that it was foolish. No, in their mind, in that moment, they simply had an illusion of wisdom. And Paul would extend this example and would say, in fact, all of human wisdom is foolish. Now, hear me please. The Bible does not disprove of knowledge or wisdom in any way. We read that God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure and the breadth of mind like the sand on a seashore. 1 Kings chapter 4, and we know about sand. It's everywhere. It's big. It's everywhere. Get wisdom, get insight, tells us the writer of the book of Proverbs. It is God who gave learning and skill and wisdom to the 4 Jewish boys who were in Babylon in the book of Daniel. No, the Bible never rejects wisdom and knowledge as something in importance. So go ahead, go to school, study, read as many great books as you could possibly read in your lifetime. People are wise. Just look at what we as people have been able to achieve in the last 100 years. Just think about it. We invented the computers. We invented the internet, and you can talk to and see anyone at any time of the day, at any point in this globe. We put men in space. We invented many cures for many deadly diseases, and most importantly, in 1928, we invented the sliced bread. So, how can I say that all human wisdom is foolish? Because as important as these things are, they are insignificant when it comes to the spiritual matters of life. The wisdom of the world is folly with God, says Paul later in chapter 3, verse 19. And yet we are constantly in danger, aren't we, of being seduced by the wisdom of the world. Our pride and our arrogance find world's wisdom very attractive, and so we bring this practical worldly wisdom into the way we raise our children, into the way we build relationships with people, build marriages, make and grow disciples. To us, that looks like wisdom. And Paul here exposes just how foolish this wisdom is by placing it next to the cross. And he says, one of these is wisdom. The other is an illusion of wisdom. So Corinthian church had its fair share of problems. People were sharply divided. There was known sexual immorality between church members. There was lack of love towards one another. People were taking each other to court. Things don't look really good for this church. But now, having been in ministry for almost 10 years, I would say that on the whole, this pretty much describes a typical church today. Now, certainly a big part of it has to do with the fact that not everyone who comes to a morning service like this would even consider themselves a Christian. Not everyone who sits in these pews this morning is a Christian, so we have to keep that in mind. But also, we know that even as Christians, we continue to sin. But the other part of it has to do with how, as Christians, we handle sin, whether sin in our own personal lives or in our relationship with other people. And here in verses 18 and 19, Paul makes a rather bold statement. He says that when it comes to spiritual matters of life, human wisdom is foolish. Why? Because it is completely and utterly unable to do anything with our sin. It has the appearance of wisdom, but it is an illusion of it. And what to most people look like cruel instrument of death, the cross of Christ in reality is the true wisdom of God. Because no matter how foolish it looks, it's the only thing that can get to the root of our problems. Christianity is a Jesus Christ religion. But without the cross of Christ, there's no Christianity. And without authentic or without understanding, biblical understanding of the cross, there's no authentic Christianity. In his famous book, Don't Waste Your Life, John Piper writes this: life is wasted if we do not grasp the glory of the cross, cherish it for the treasure that it is, and cleave to it or hold on to it as the highest price of every pleasure and the deepest comfort of every pain. Take any of Paul's letters and you will see that he cannot talk long about Christian joy or Christian ethics or Christian fellowship or Christian doctrines or anything else for that matter without finally connecting it to the cross. Prophet Isaiah saw how human leadership failed during the Assyrian invasion in Judah because they relied on human wisdom and human power. For the Assyrian commander Naaman from 2 Kings chapter 5, dipping into the Jordan River 7 times seemed foolish and absurd. In verse 19, Paul shows how human wisdom also falls short in understanding the importance of the cross. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not this year, but a day will come in everyone's life when the cross will expose, friends, the reality of our wisdom. We either live like fools for the sake of Christ today and experience the power and the wisdom of God for all eternity, or we try to live as the wise people of this world and experience eternally His wrath. Someone said, as Christians, we need to remember that if we preach and live the gospel faithfully, the culture around us that will mock us. But if we compromise the Bible with the wisdom of the world, they will still mock us. So Christians, our goal isn't to live in such a way that to seek popularity in this culture so that we can somehow use this wisdom of this world to influence the world for Christ. No, the goal of our lives must be about bringing glory to God and His Son, Jesus Christ. And if the culture, if the world thinks us foolish, so be it. So be it. Young people, will you be ashamed to believe in what the Bible teaches when the world thinks of you as a fool? Young people, Christian, will you rejoice in the middle of darkness when it is foolish to rejoice in moments like that? Men, will you reject the world's idea of success and live as fools for the sake of Christ? Will our values, our generosity, the way we raise our children, build relationships, spend time and invest into our marriages, will all of that be considered foolish by the world's standards? Because the wisdom of this world will turn out to be foolish. But the cross is the wisdom and the power of God. But the cross not only exposes the reality for what it is, the cross confronts people with this reality. It is certainly in the last 2,000 years of human history have softened the horrific image of the cross. We don't see it. We don't come face to face with the gruesomeness of the cross anymore like first century Christians once did. And yet, because of what the cross stands today, even today, most modern people reject the cross. You see, to the average modern man, the idea that a Jewish man, Jewish teacher from 2,000 years ago has anything to do with their life is simply ridiculous. It's absurd. Now, sure, we could use some of the parables and some of the moral lessons that Jesus taught and somehow, somewhere, apply them here and there in our lives. After all, we just love powerful life principle and powerful quotes that we could just carry with us. But beyond that, it's foolish to think that his life or his death, as gruesome as it might have been, has any notable effect on my life today. I think part of the reason people reject the Christ or the message of the cross is that it's just too simple for them. You see, we live in a world where complex problems demand complex solution. And if my eternity is important, and most people in the world will say that it is important, then the message of the cross is just too simple. It's foolish to think that where I spend eternity somehow rests on a Jewish teacher who was brutally crucified 2,000 years ago. It's foolish. If there is a solution to my eternity problem, it cannot be that simple. It demands a more complex solution. The gospel just doesn't make sense. And so people reject the message of the cross because it is unreasonable, unbelievable, and just too simple. Well, Paul says, let's bring in the experts. In verse 20. Maybe the experts can shed some light into this whole mystery of the cross. Perhaps the experts can convince us that what God has accomplished on the cross of Christ is of significance. Let's bring in the experts that we can trust. Well, where's the wise one? It's not here. Where's the teacher of the law, the scholar? It's not here. But even if he showed up, he would not be qualified to speak. Where's the debater of this age? Where's the scholars? Where's the gifted in philosophy and rhetoric? Where is he? Where are they? Can't find him. But even if he would come, he would have nothing valid to say. Why? Because God made foolish the wisdom of the world. And as the skeptic looks around to the intellectual, the philosopher, the thinkers of this world, all he sees is the bankruptcy and the foolishness of mere human brilliance. And the skeptic concludes that if these accomplished and intelligent people do not believe the message of the cross, then maybe they're right. You see, with so many conflict ideas out there, we tend to listen to people with experience, with a piece of paper, with education. And if so many of them reject the message of the cross, then maybe they're onto something. You know, it seems to me that Paul isn't doing a very good job in advertising this whole Christianity thing. Now, let's say, for example, you're trying to sell something to someone, a timeshare. You don't show them the long checking lines, the overcrowded pools, the rundown playground. You don't show them that on a brochure. No. You show them a vision of their dream. Now picture with me this. A family of 4. It's always 4 for some reason. A family of 4, boy and a girl, a family of 4 just strolling on the beach. All healthy, happy, smiling. They just love to be there with one another. But the picture of Christian community that doesn't look that appealing. Paul already told us that there's not many intelligent people there. So who is there then? Well, not many wise, Paul says in verse 26. Not many are powerful, not many who came from good families. In fact, Paul continues that according to human wisdom, human standards, the majority of Christians are foolish, weak, despised, and simply amount to nothing. How would you like to be part of the community like that? How would you like to be part of the community that rejects the modern wisdom and popularity and instead embraces the message of a humiliated, crucified Christ? Anyone? The message of the cross confronts people with its simplicity. It's just too simple. It's unreasonable. It doesn't make sense to us. And on top of that, Christians are just not that impressive. Now, I don't know all of you. I know you. I don't know all of you, but I've spoken to many of you, and I must say that you are not that impressive. You might be good people and decent people, but there's nothing spectacular or impressive about you or me. But that's the reality. And the cross confronts us with this reality. But the cross also does something else. The cross confronts and forces people to see the depth of human sin. If we are correct to say that a complex problem requires a complex solution, then the cross confronts us as the solution to the most complex of all human problems. Because here's what the message of the cross is saying: you are very, very evil. Your will, your emotions, your intellect, all infected with sin. Now, you might have not done all the terrible things out there, but in the right situation, we are capable of all sorts of evil. That is because we are sinful not just in theory or in practice, but in our nature. Sin is part of the very fiber of our being. We all have gone astray and turned into our own ways, says Isaiah, and this made us slaves to sin, writes Paul in Romans 7. If we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves, bluntly puts John in 1 John 1:18. The sinful nature is universal to all people. It started with disobedience of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, and then it was been passed from one generation to another to all of humanity. Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. And in this way, death came to all people because all sins, Romans 5, verse 12. But the problem is not that we have sinned and now we have this sinful nature. The bigger problem is that there's punishment that's coming because of that. And that is a significant problem for all of us. For all of us. And Paul points to the cross and says, and that's what it took to fix this problem. That's what it took. It's precisely because humans are so sinful that it took life and death of Jesus Christ to resolve our problem of sin, both yours and mine. The message of the cross might be too simple for many people. The church, the people of Christ might not be that impressive. The idea of our sin doesn't sit really well with ourselves. But that's the reality of the cross, and it confronts people. It makes people uncomfortable. Cross gets right into people's faces. And the question is, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with the message of the cross? Because we can't just ignore it, dismiss it. We are forced to do something with this message of the cross. And as I see it, we only have two options. Option number one, we can reject it. We can look for another solution to our sin problem. We can try to find another way to avoid our sin problem. We can try to come up with a different grading system where my sin doesn't look nearly as bad as your sin. We're clever people. Just look at what we've been able to accomplish in the last 50 years. But God says it's foolish to think that you are wiser than I am. My thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways. For as heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Isaiah 55. There isn't another way, there isn't another path, there isn't another grading system. The most brilliant of all human wisdom is foolish, it's ridiculous. There's only my solution, my way, and my standard of holiness, says God. And that solution is the crucified Jesus Christ. Now, you could reject the message of the cross, you could certainly do that, but know this, that any other solution that you can come up with to address your sin problem will be not enough, not be enough. So one option is to reject the message of the cross, and the other one is to accept it. Accept the reality of my sin. Accept that the message of the crucified Christ, as simple as it is the most important message of all. So the message of the cross exposes the reality for what it is. The cross confronts us with this reality, and finally, the cross proclaims the reality. Now look with me again, starting with verse 21. For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. So there's two parts to this text. First, Paul says that without the cross, we cannot know God. We cannot know God aside from the cross. How so? Well, if according to Colossians 1 and Hebrew 1, Christ is a visible image of the invisible God, shouldn't we be able to know God by looking at Christ? Well, take Sermon on the Mount, for example, where for 3 chapters, Jesus speaks about the heart of God from the Jewish law. He says things like this: "You have heard it said, but I say to you." Now, what is Jesus doing? He gets underneath the written text to show people the heart of God. This is what you heard, but this is what God wanted you to say or hear. This is what the Pharisees and the scribes teach you, but this is where the heart of God is. Now, Jesus never contradicts the teachings of Jesus Christ. No, he simply explains to them from their writing the teachings or the intentions behind their words. And so if God's word is a direct extension of his nature, shouldn't we be able to know God by simply studying this book on its own? Here's what Jesus says. He gives us the answer to this question. On the night Jesus was betrayed, surrounded by his disciples, he said, "I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now." Okay, not now. When, Jesus? When the Spirit of truth comes. You see, you can't know God simply by studying the Sermon on the Mount or by looking at the life of Jesus on its own. We must first become the type of people Jesus describes in the Sermon on the Mountain. And that only becomes possible when the Spirit of Christ comes into our life as a result of the cross of Christ. See, in the sermon, Jesus ascribes blessedness not to the successful, not to the powerful, not to the self-confident, but to the grieving, to the persecuted, to the poor. Why? Because they are driven to abandon their self-reliance and seek the grace of God on God's own terms. In his book, Meditating on the Word, German pastor-theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer says these words: "If it is I who say where God will be, I will always find there's a God who corresponds to me. God who is agreeable to me, but if it is God who says where he will be, the place is the cross of Christ." But let's push this as far as we can. Let's say we diligently study the life of Christ, and we all should. We carefully follow His words into the very heart of God. We observe the way Jesus relates to people, and we become the experts of Christ. Now, for the sake of the argument, let's assume that you and I get to a place where we can confidently say that we know God. Then what? What are you going to do with all that knowledge? Because you see, we're not saved by what we know, but by the one that we believe in. We're saved by the person who was brutally executed on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins. The message of the cross strips prideful humans of all our brilliance and intellectual achievements and drives us to our knees at the foot of the horrible instrument of execution and says, there and only there can we have forgiveness. There and only there can we know and find God. Why? Because only on the cross do we see both God's holiness and His love at the same moment. The cross showed us more about God than anything else ever has. What gives me a great deal of comfort is that it's not that I lack intelligence to know God on my own, but that was His plan all along. To reveal Himself through the foolishness of the cross so that none of us could say, I did this. No. This is the wisdom and the power of God. But God not only shows Himself through the message of the cross, He pleases Him to save people through the cross. It pleases God when the message of the cross is both preached and when people believe that message as a result of preaching. Paul divided the world into two categories. We see this again in verse 18. Those who are perishing and those who are being saved. The spiritually lost people stumble over the cross because to them it's foolish. Now, Jews demanded a sign, but the only sign that Jesus gave them was a sign of a Messiah dying on the cross like a bloody criminal. And so they rejected the Messiah. Greeks rejected the cross because they were looking for wisdom. And how could this ignorant Jew compare to their intellectual titans like Plato and Aristotle? So they rejected the message of the cross as insignificant and foolish. But to those who believe, Paul says, Christ becomes the power and the wisdom of God. How? Through a simple preaching of the gospel. But here's the thing. Whether you preach the gospel from a pulpit or across a table in a coffee shop, we are always tempted to sound convincing, persuasive in our arguments. We want our message to get through. But Paul later in the beginning of chapter 2 says, when I came to you, I decided to know nothing except. I decided to know nothing except Christ and Him crucified. You see, the calling is a work of God. He is the one who gives life and faith to people. He is the one who delivers people from the domain of darkness and transfers them into the kingdom of His beloved Son. The calling is a work of God, but the task of preaching is our task. Preaching to those who are perishing in hopes that they will have faith and repentance, absolutely. But also preaching to those who are saved. Now, why is that? Because we not only have been saved by the gospel, but according to verse 18, we are being saved by the gospel. In his letter, Paul always explains the salvation in terms of three tenses: past, present, and the future. There's a well-known analogy that kind of shows what that looks like. Analogy that describes people who are being saved from a sinking ship. Now, we see ships everywhere, so you can imagine a sinking ship, a big sinking ship. So these people are being saved by a lifeboat. One, it is those people who are saved. They have been rescued from the danger, so they're saved. But second, as the lifeboat moves to the shore, they are in the process of being saved. And three, sitting in this lifeboat, they long for the moment when the boat, this lifeboat finally reaches the solid ground, and it is in that moment they would finally be saved. An old Scottish pastor wrote this: if we would be holy, we must get to the cross and stay there. Otherwise, despite all our efforts, allegiance, fasting, giving, praying, and good works, we will miss the genuine sanctification and the humble, gracious character that comes from a profound understanding of the cross. So, how do we get to the cross and stay there? Well, neither Paul nor Jesus Christ gives us a formula how to do that. But I think a good place to start for all of us is to ask ourselves a question: am I even getting to the cross? When was the last time I thought about the cross and its significance in my life today? Do I get to the cross? Do I stay there? And so how often we get to the cross and how we get to the cross will vary from season to season in our life, but we either get there and stay there or we don't. And our holiness then is either genuine or imaginary. Now it's kind of shameful that in this building here we do not have a cross. You see one? We have Jesus the shepherd with his sheep. That's great. But we don't have a cross. But you know what it looks like, right? It's nothing glamorous, just two pieces of wood. But when it is the cross of Christ, oh, what a difference those two pieces of wood make. The cross exposes the illusion of human wisdom. It confronts the reality of our brokenness and sin, and the cross proclaims the truth about salvation only through Jesus Christ. So Christians, look to the cross of Christ and trust God's wisdom even when it seems foolish to the rest of this world. When you begin to have doubts, go back to the place where God displayed his faithfulness to us as people and believe and remember that God has not changed. He is still the same. When you feel hopeless and helpless to change yourself, remember only the cross has the power to change. Become fools in this world for the sake of Christ. But to those of you who feel and think that you could somehow reason your way to God, God says no. Anyone who wants to get salvation has to go through the cross. Anyone who wants to be saved must come to him through the cross. No matter how smart you think you are, God says you are a fool to do life without Christ and his cross. So come to him right now. Lay down your wisdom, your pride. On the cross, Jesus Christ already paid for all of your sins, but you must come to the cross of Christ. So what stands in your way to come to him right now? Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the Christ. We thank you for this gruesome, this foolish, this unexpected, unbelievable instrument of our salvation. Father, we admit to you that we don't go there as often as we need to. And our life becomes evidence of that. The conflicts in our marriages, the issues in relationships, many of them stem from the fact that we don't go to the cross, and I pray that you would forgive us. I pray, Father, that we all as a congregation developed a habit of going to the cross daily and remembering what it took for me to be saved and forgiven and to have hope and eternity. Not so that we would feel bad about that, but so that we would get strength and draw our confidence from that. And remember that foolishness will one day become wisdom. And the wisdom of this world will turn out to be foolishness. Father, help us as men and women, as young people and old people, to become fools for the sake of the cross. Not look at the wisdom of this world, but consider your wisdom as the wisest of all. And know that you are a loving and a gracious God who will one day come back and take us home. We long for that day to see you so that we can again worship your God. Amen.